All right, guys, thank you so much for coming this afternoon. I hope you're able to stave off your food coma. I'll make it as challenging as possible and be as boring as I can, okay? So don't worry. Well, dear friends, web components are coming. And if you're at all familiar with internet culture, you know exactly where this is going to end up. All right, so real quickly, if you want to see the slides, you can check them out of this GitHub repository. You can either do that now or do it later. If we all synchronize our yarn installs, then maybe we can break down the internet successfully. So let's do that. I'm not going to say anything about myself because we're short on time, and I'm really not that important. We can talk about long walks on the beach later. So what are web components? Raise your hand if you've ever heard of web components. Okay, maybe close to half, and maybe some in the middle. So pretty much, if you're not familiar with it, web components, it's the idea that, okay, I can define my own custom HTML tag that has built-in styles and its own defined behavior that's all encapsulated to that, a single instance of that element itself. Now, we're really familiar with the idea of components in websites because of modern front-end frameworks. But when we talk about web components, we're talking about, okay, the browser's giving us the ability to do that without any third-party library. So there's three DOM specifications that really support building web components. So those three web standards are, first and the most important, is the custom element specification. That's what allows me to say, okay, you know what? When I put Hayden-is-cool in the DOM, instead of the browser just saying, oh, I don't know what that is, and just skipping over it, actually renders out whatever content and behavior and styles that I assign to that tag. The next is Shadow DOM. Shadow DOM is also very important. So pretty much what that does is it allows me to ensure that you can't access the contents of my custom element outside of the element itself. So like, for example, if I'm writing a third-party component that I'm expecting others to use in their web applications, then I can kind of protect you from shooting yourself in the foot by saying, okay, you can't touch what's inside here, and it also protects the styles inside of my web component to make sure that, you know, some conflicting style sheet out in the wilds of my website aren't going to unexpectedly conflict with the styles that inside of my web component. So it creates a very safe sandbox for your styles. And lastly is HTML templates. It's not a huge thing, but it's important. It pretty much allows, you know, if you have multiple instances of the same component, by using just a quick change, you can ensure that the browser doesn't have to reparse the same HTML every single time you stick a new instance of your component on the page. There's also one other that used to be a part of the web components family. That was the HTML import specification, but Chrome was really the only one who supported that, and other browsers said, nah, I don't really like that. And so Chrome had it for a while, and actually in Chrome 73, it's going away. And it was kind of gross anyways, so we're really not missing out on much there. So why should I care about web components? Well, first is if I build a component that's understandable by the browser and doesn't depend on any third-party library, then that means that, okay, I might be working on a team that uses multiple different front-end frameworks, and then that allows me to reuse with a little bit of extra work for each framework, but I can more or less reuse the same components across projects and across frameworks. So you can pretty much just write once and use across different frameworks much more easily. And also, if you're like really paranoid about the front-end JavaScript world, which probably most front-end people are, because things change all the time, then writing your presentational components using web components will kind of future-proof you, because once things are built into the browser, they're not going to change, right? So our front-end frameworks can change underneath our feet as much as they want, #AngularJS. But the browser isn't going to do that, because this has been a much more longer process to arrive on these APIs and these specifications than just front-end frameworks. Next benefit would be it gives you the potential to ship less code, right? Which is always great for our users because, you know, if I don't have to ship as much code, if I don't need to ship an extra, you know, 200, 300 kilobytes so that the browser knows how to treat my custom elements, then that's much less load time that the user has to wait while waiting for your web application, and just an overall better user experience. Next, it gives us the potential for perhaps better performance, because when things are built into the DOM itself, the browsers can optimize certain cases that maybe we might not even think about, that we might not understand as users of these specifications. And it's the same case that goes on with different, for example, array operations. Over the years, browsers have been able to optimize certain operations that weren't always as performant. Next, web components give us the ability to write much more semantic markup. So this example is from Gmail, and probably could just as well be most of our web applications these days. It's just a bunch of divs, and we use all these divs in different ways and kind of coerce it to do what we want it to do, which is fine in most cases. But when you're looking at that code as a developer, that doesn't make much sense. Like, you really have to know the ins and outs of the code base to understand what all these different divs are doing. And so the big issue with, or one of the big issues with web development today, is that the markup that we write is not representative of the resulting UI. Next, it gives you the ability to bundle markup styles and scripts all together. So I kind of like to think of this as the jQuery bootstrap problem. How many of you have, probably most of us, have ever used Bootstrap and jQuery in a website? Yeah, and maybe most of us still do. And I mean, I'm not trying to knock on these things at all, because both of these tools were really a leg up for and really helped us move forward with the web. And actually, to date, Bootstrap has the most stars on GitHub. Actually, no, second most, only second to FreeCodeCamp. But beyond any other development framework, it has way more stars than any other. But if you think back to developing websites with both of these tools, it was you as the developer, it was your responsibility to make sure, okay, you had pulled in all the right scripts, you pulled in all of the right style sheets, and then when you actually wanted to use Bootstrap components, you had to make sure the right classes went on the right elements, and then you had to make sure you had to write jQuery to access their elements and then use their jQuery extensions. So it was really messy and very, very error prone. So not a great way of doing that. So building web components gives us kind of a way out of doing that. And lastly, what I know most of you came here for, there's something missing. There's something really unsatisfying about that. I feel like there's something missing here, but I think you can kind of fill in the rest with your imagination. But web components have been a long time coming, and now they're finally here. We'll look at browser support in a minute. So kind of the development around web components and building that into the browsers started back in 2011. And there's a great Google I/O video from 2012 where Google's really pushed this forward a lot. They've done a great job with pushing it forward. So in 2012, they had a great talk, probably the only web development video from 2012 that's still relatively relevant these days, but where they introduced the idea and kind of discussed the problems. So it's been since then that this has kind of been working. And actually, just a little nugget of trivia, I did some poking around, and I found back in 1998, Microsoft, of all organizations, actually had a proposal that they put out there called HTML components. It looks much different from web components today, but it was kind of the same idea, like, hey, we need a more convenient way of doing this. So we're probably glad that that didn't actually pan out. And the idea of shadow DOM has actually existed for a while. If you think about certain native HTML components, like maybe video, for example, you just put the video tag and put your attributes there, and it shows up. It's got the slider bar and the different options. So there's different elements inside there, but we just can't see those. And in most of those native elements, we don't have access to style very well. So that idea has been around for quite a while. But it wasn't until 2017 that V1 of the custom element specification finally landed, and that's where all the browsers were like, okay, we like this, let's do this thing. And in addition to that, nowadays we're starting to see third-party libraries use web components under the hood, right? So if you pull in maybe some third-party component library, some of these guys are starting to use web components. So one example that we use where I work is the Ionic framework. So they're working on their 4th version now, and they've rewritten everything that they did before, and now everything under the hood is web components. And their library is extremely smaller compared to what it was before. So the million-dollar question is, well, what about browser support? And actually, it's pretty good. As of, hey, they're working on it, okay? They are working on it. That's Edge. That's Edge. I'm not gonna. I had IE up there before, but I was like, it's just like what you can just probably guess pretty easily what IE supports. But yeah, so Firefox, as of I think last month, has full-fledged support for web components. Safari and Chrome have had it for a while. Edge is working on it. And even in the case where, even for IE users, there's polyfills out there. There's a polyfill for custom elements, most notably. There's also a polyfill for the shadow DOM, but it's not as easy to use. It actually, instead of just, okay, developing as you normally would, you have to kind of develop much differently, and it's not as performant either. Kind of interestingly, GitHub, you may have seen that GitHub recently had a long article, really good article about, they finally moved off of jQuery and kind of why they did that and how. And in the article, they mentioned that they've started to use the custom element specification, but they've kind of shied away from doing anything with Shadow DOM yet because they don't want to have to depend on those polyfills for now. But Shadow DOM eventually will catch up, and we'll be able to use that. And kind of one last note, kind of want to kind of gotcha with writing these things or writing web components that you're anticipating running in IE is, so the web component specification, we'll take a look at a couple examples. It depends on ES 2015 classes, and you can't use those in IE, so you're going to end up transpiling your code. Classes are gone, so there's like an extra step, and you can still get it to work in IE even without using ES 2015 classes. All right, so another question, okay, well, are they production ready? Which I guess is kind of an odd question to ask about a browser feature. But as I mentioned, GitHub has started to use custom elements. Some websites that most of, or if not all of us use are using web components. I want to look at a quick example of that. Oh, and it's down here. I'll move that real quick. So YouTube actually uses web components. If we look here, let's see, if we inspect Christmas Unicorn by Sufjan Stevens and look at the elements going on here, we see all these kind of weird looking tags. And what they did, Google recently rewrote YouTube to use one of their web component tools called Polymer, which we'll mention slightly here in a minute. But so if you pretty much inspect any page in YouTube, it's filled with all of their custom elements that they've used. And so, I mean, I kind of feel like if web components are good enough for YouTube, they're probably good enough for the rest of us. And actually, one other example, just for funsies, a website that most of us have probably all seen. Oh, geez, I can't get it. All right, that's okay. We'll look at that later. But actually, if you look at the HRDevFest website and inspect the page, it's also using web components. So pretty cool. Alrighty. Now, what we've all come here for, demos. So first example, I really struggle sometimes when writing examples of coming up with a good, like, motivating example that is real world as well as kind of demonstrates the things that I want to. So I just kind of created this kitchen sink that's really useless in and of itself, but it demonstrates all the things that I want to get across. So real quick, let's look at the code for this over here. All right, let me move this up. And we'll go to kitchen sink here. Let me close this guy. Kitchen sink. Can you guys see this well enough? Okay, cool. All right, So there's a lot going on here, but we'll kind of go over the basics of building a web component using the native browser APIs. So first thing you do is you have a class that extends HTML element. If you ever have a constructor, you have to make a call to super. One thing that we're doing here, if we go down to this method here, this is kind of where I'm initializing the web component. So here we can see an example of using the shadow DOM. So pretty much all I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, this, because now this is actually an HTML element. So I can say this and attach shadow, and that gives me, that says, okay, you know what? We're going to stick a shadow DOM, a shadow tree, on the root of this element, which pretty much means, okay, anything that goes inside of there is encapsulated from the outside world. And then what I'm doing here is kind of tricky. This is using the HTML templates. And pretty much I have this template defined up here. This is all it's doing. And I've created this element. I just assigned the inner HTML to this markup. And the value of doing this, it's a little convoluted, but pretty much using this template instead of just saying, okay, well, shadow root.inner HTML, and then assigning it the markup. Doing this, the DOM only has to parse this once. If I want to have a bunch of like random crap kitchen sink components all over my website, that would be a horrible website. But if I did want to do that, the DOM would only have to parse this guy right here once, which is great for performance. Let's see, couple key things. There's the specification gives you a couple of lifecycle hooks. So you've got a connected callback, and that's typically where you're going to do things like, okay, you know, getting references to some of your elements in your markup and initializing your template. And then there's another thing here where we can actually watch for attributes changing on the element. So actually, let's take a look at that. So if I go here, let me inspect this guy. All right, kitchen sink. So here we see that name is Bob. So if I go ahead and change this to Dylan, then we can see, oh, well, guess what? That web component was watching for changes on that attribute, and I just wrote a quick line that said, okay, well, hey, if this attribute changes, go ahead and update the template. So that's pretty cool. Let's see. Furthermore, let me get a reference to this guy. Let kitchen equal to document dot query selector. I didn't actually know any of these browser APIs until I started playing with web components. All right, did I get that? Sure did. All right, so there's my kitchen. There's my kitchen sink. Additionally, I'm going to say kitchen, and I put a setter on my kitchen web component that says, well, you know what? If I change name, let's change this to Kevin. Kevin's a cool guy. Then, oh, hey, guess what? Magically, no, it's not what I wanted to do. Let's go back. All right, sweet. I changed that, updated the template, and also, if I go back to my elements, I'll see that I've reflected that property back to the attribute on the element itself. You might not always want to do that, and if you're going to write web components using the native browser APIs, then one thing that you'll have to come to terms with is thinking about, okay, well, do I want to set attributes? Do I want to set properties? Do I want to use both? That's not really something that we have to think about. It's kind of abstracted away from us when we use front-end frameworks. And if you use other tools that help you build web components, you might not have to worry about this so much. But if there's ever any doubt, the best thing to do is to take note from, okay, native elements. How do they do things? How do they use the native elements versus, how do they use attributes versus properties, and kind of model your web components after how they do things. There's a lot of other things we could go over here. Let's see, we can like project content into this guy. So if you see, let's go over here, back to the markup. I go to index. okay, well, here's my kitchen sink, and some stuff was rendered automatically by that, but then I was also able to stick stuff inside of here. And if you can look at all these examples, I'd encourage you just to pull this down and play with it at some point. But you can see how, okay, we can write CSS selectors and kind of style the stuff that's going on in here. One last thing I want to look at with this example is kind of the value and the power of using the shadow DOM. So let's see. All right, so paragraph element. Where's my paragraph element? All right, so yeah, so that first line right there that we saw, so-and-so is cool, is a part of my shadow DOM. All right, so I'm gonna commit the cardinal CSS sin. It's okay, we've all done it. This is a safe place. All right, so I'm gonna commit this horrible crime against the browser, and we'll see what happens. And we've been absolved of our sins by the power of the shadow DOM. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Sorry if y'all aren't too excited about that. All right. There's some other things we can talk about, but I'm going to skip over those for the sake of time. Moving forward, this is another example you can look at if you want. Yeah, it's fun. It would be more exciting if I had some pictures of maybe home store owner characters changing as I went through the different tabs. Homework. One problem you might think about if you look at that example is I can't very easily look at the web component JavaScript file and know what it's trying to do, right? Because a minute ago I talked about, well, web isn't very semantic. And if you look at the JavaScript I wrote, it's not very semantic either. And so there's tools out there to help us, and I'll kind of give you a preview of one of those nice tools. Let's go to Cool Timer. So there's this really neat tool called lit.html. It's part of the Polymer project from Google. And by just pulling in these two simple functions from that library, what I can do is write a web component that looks, maybe if you're similar to, if you're familiar with how components are written in React, we can kind of structure our web component in a similar way by just using these tools here. So if you look, at the bottom I've created a render function, and what that does is it says, okay, it runs a template literal through this tag, and then we can look at this and it's much more clear to understand what's going on, and then I can, inside of that, reference properties on my web component that I want to display in my template, and then this render function, what it does is I specify a target, so I'm going to say, okay, well, the shadow root of my component. And the value of this is, if you're working directly with the DOM, it's really easy to make bad performance mistakes, right? If you're saying, inner HTML is equal to this all the time, it's not great. And it's really hard and really nitpicky to try to get DOM operations right. So the value of this is that it abstracts it away from you, and this render function will only make the updates that are necessary. So even just using this one little tool, we're much further along of having much easier to understand web components. In closing, I want to, yeah, that's a fun little timer whipped up, so that's cool. All right, I could do this all day. I'll just do this for another minute if y'all don't mind. Yeah, okay, that's it. We don't need to do anything else today. In closing, I'm going to go over a couple quick tools that you might want to use if you're interested in web components. So you should definitely, it's always helpful to understand what the native browser APIs do, but it's maybe not the best thing to do in the real world in production. So Polymer is a great tool from Google that kind of gives you a leg up in building web components. It's a pretty small library. All these are pretty small libraries. Stencil is kind of a neat thing from the Ionic framework, the people behind that. If you look at it, it looks like the love child of Angular and React. It has Angular's looks and React's brain, but it enables you to build web components. It has a bit of magic going on behind the scenes that I'm not super comfortable with, but it's a nice tool, and they've dog-fooded this really well. Skate.js is another library, haven't used it, and Vaadin is another example of third-party libraries that are building their component libraries using web components that can be run essentially anywhere. All right, here's a couple resources. This is your study for the weekend. A lot of stuff here, but take a look. A lot of fun, neat stuff. And that's it. So I'm not going to take any questions because of time, but come talk to me. I'll be here all day, and afterwards, if you want to talk, I'd be happy to talk about this stuff. Or you can reach out to me. If you're interested in the worthless crap that I put on Twitter, you can check me out there and the random code examples I have on GitHub. But besides that, thank you very much, and I hope you go and build some web components.